Morning, everybody. It's 10:20 on Wednesday, the 9th of June, which of course means that many of you are in English paper one, and I hope it's going well for you. Others are at home, I suppose, getting ready for home ec or engineering, or maybe studying for your maths on Friday. I said to my guys on the 21-day challenge that I would make a recording of the paper one predictions and exam strategy tips. So here it is. So we'll start off with the predictions, but I'll go through exam strategy tips and exam technique tips at the end. So from this, you'll see here that what I'm saying here is anything in orange is a strong tip. Now, why do I do this? I do these predictions every year. And the reason I do it is primarily one thing. It's that the course is so long that sometimes students say that almost they don't know what to study on the days before the exam. Because they'd say to me, I could start studying differentiation. I could spend a whole day doing differentiation. So it's so vast that sometimes they end up doing nothing. So to prevent that, I give these predictions and say, right, study these. Some of them will come up. Chances are they won't all come up, but some of them will come up. And you'll have practiced them on the days beforehand. And they'll be fresh in your mind going into the exam. Okay. So I'll start off, I'll go through it nice and fast. So in algebra, I'm going to say a strong tip for modulus graphs, the V-shaped graphs, to be asked. They haven't been asked in Project Maths except for the 2012 sample paper. There's only a couple of things that came up on that sample paper that have not been asked since. Modulus graphs is one. Binomial expansion is also something which hasn't come up very often in the exams since 2012. And I think it's likely. I think it could come up in algebra or it could come up in complex numbers. Simultaneous equations question, I would suggest possibly more likely one with a linear and a non-linear. But it could be one with the three linear equations with the three unknowns as well. It could come up, if it doesn't come up in paper one, it could come up in the circle question in paper two also. An unknown coefficients question, there was one in 2019, question one. I think something similar to that could come up, or one of those ones that has never come up, but it's in all the textbooks where you're doing the long division, maybe a quadratic into a cubic, and you're asked to show something like P is equal to 4 times QR. Okay. If you're not familiar with them, don't bother trying to learn them now. I'd say if you're not familiar with those, and as a general bit of advice, if there's something here that you've never seen before, I would be inclined not to try to learn it now. An example here might be an algebraic identity proof. So these are in the textbooks. They're also on page 6 of our algebra notes. They're in the day one folder. An example is this, like prove that a squared plus b squared is greater or equal to 2ab. It's algebraic, it's an identity, which means it's true for all values of the variable. And what you always do is you're always forming perfect squares, which are always positive. That's always the trick. Logs and indices, those index equations, long questions have come up a lot where you're saying, it's exponential growth. I think a log function would be more likely than that in this year's paper rather than the exponential. But an index equation question is possible, one of those ones where sometimes you let like 3 to the power of x equal to y and go from there. Complex number, I'm going to give a strong tip for the general polar form of De Moivre's theorem, where you solve and thereby find the roots of the equation. The transformation, the one with the 4 or 5 dots on the Argand diagram, I think that's overdue. You could be asked to prove something like this. It was a common question previously. It's in the textbooks. It has never come up. It involves binomial expansion. So I do think that's a place where they could bring in binomial expansion and also get you to do a proof. Sequence series. I just mentioned one last thing about that previous one. Again, if you've never learned that before, I wouldn't go learning it now. If it comes up and you've never learned it, okay, you have to miss that question. You do a different question, but that's not the end of the world. A long question with a diagram related to a quadratic or geometric series and sequence series is likely. Why do I say that? Well, look, it is very popular over the last number of years. There are 4 long questions this year. So if they didn't have one of those, it might be it might be almost difficult to come up with 4 long questions that didn't have any sequences of series in there. A question that hasn't come up since the sample papers again is the writing using the sum to infinity to write a recurring decimal as a fraction has not been asked since that sample paper of 2012. Those sample papers were reused, by the way, in 2013 and 14, so sometimes you might see them as those with those numbers. Being asked to prove the Sn or S infinity formula, that's a possibility. Again, it's in our form of proofs document. They're not difficult. If you're going for a H1 and you haven't seen them before, maybe I'll break my rule and say maybe have a look at those in that document, because they're not that difficult. If you're going for H6, I'd forget about them. Financial maths, possibly a long question. A lot of people think it'll be a long question this year. I'm not convinced on that. I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't even come up at all. But it could come up, and there's room for it in the long questions this year because of the 4 long questions. Changing yearly rates to monthly rates would be very likely if it does come up, and forming a geometric series, what I call key skill 1, the changing yearly to monthly, and key skill 2, forming the geometric series. Functions, I think, will be a strong part. The injective, surjective, bijective functions, I think they're due. An inverse function could come up. It's so easy if you know it, so impossible if you don't know the trick. A log function, as I mentioned earlier. Completing the square is a possibility. I think it came up in 2017 or 18 and hasn't come up since. Watch out for trig functions in paper 1. It's not necessarily a tip. It's something that's happened for a couple of years. The periodic functions, they're associated with trigonometry, of course, paper 2. But they can come up in paper 1 because they're functions. Differentiation, we'll be going through this today in our lesson today at 8 o'clock. Connected rate of change, that's something where if you're looking for the rate of change of the radius, dr dt is equal to dr d something times d something dt, and that something will be the 3rd variable in the question. I think that's likely. Area and volume with max, min, and rate of change could also come up. Okay, so again, I think like an area and volume diagram, it could be a cylinder or cuboid, something like that, and you're finding the max or the min, maybe the volume, and a rate of change as it's being filled, something like that. dv dt be the rate of change of volume with respect to time. There could be a kind of a short question on differentiation. So differentiating logs, exponential, trig functions, they're all there on page 25, but you need to know the chain rule part as well. A question on graphs of functions and their derivatives is also overdue, and that's in maybe if I didn't mention this already. So I made an extra pre based on these predictions. It's in the extra stuff folder on the 21-day challenge. Okay. So there's a pre in the marking scheme, and there's a question on this in there. So it's like you start off with a cubic, you differentiate, you get a quadratic, you differentiate again, you get a linear, but you got to match them up. It's a question that we thought would be more popular. I think 2013 it came up, and we kind of thought maybe it'd come up quite a lot, but it hasn't really come up since. Integration, I think the area between 2 curves is a likely question. Again, it used to be a popular one before, hasn't come up that much in the last number of years. It has come up, I'm picturing one, there was an e to the power of x, e to the power minus x, and the line y or x equals 0.75, so it has come up, but not that often. Average value is very easy, except that the formula is not in the table book. I've seen students looking through that table book, looking for that formula and not finding it. Trapezoidal rule could come up. The formula for that is there under area in the table book. If you don't know what the trapezoidal rule is, I'd be inclined maybe not to go learning it right now, not to learn it. It's not that it's that difficult, but you do need someone to teach it to you. Because for some reason, they decided to label the width as h, and that always confuses people the first time. Number systems, so there could be the question on Venn diagrams, where you got like complex numbers and inside that real numbers, inside that rational numbers, etc. Something like that could come up. And the other thing that could come up here is constructing root 2 and root 3. Now that's in my constructions video for you. Not that difficult, but again, you do have to be taught it really. So you want to watch that if you're going to plan on doing a question like that if it comes up. Okay, so what I'd say is some of those predictions are likely to appear. I can say with 95% confidence that some of those predictions will appear. And why I do it again is, it gives you something to focus on. I'm actually going to start off my exam strategy almost with the same thing, something to focus on. So you can just read it there for a moment. That first line, it says, when the exam starts, try to find 1 or 2 short questions you definitely like and do them. Here's the thing. When you open up the maths paper 1 this year, there'll be 10 questions in there and you're doing 6 of them. Different people will advise different things, and there's no one definite answer to this because it depends on the student, and it might even depend on the paper. My advice would be not to read the whole thing straight away. I think it'll be overwhelming. I think there'll be too much information in there. I think your mind will be thinking about which questions should I do too much. Short questions, you're very familiar with what the short questions are. I imagine there'll be a couple of tricky ones in there, but there'll also be a couple of straightforward enough ones. I would find 1 or 2 short questions, it might be question 1, but it might be question 5 and 6. Okay, so don't just start at question 1. Have a good look through them, find a couple you like, and then do the 2 short questions there and then. After that stage, you know yourself, same as English today, if you did it like once you've your first question done in English, you're gonna, you'll take a deep breath and you'll kind of relax, you'll exhale at that point, and you're in the exam at that stage. Okay, so what happens next? At that point, you have 2 short questions done. Hopefully they've gone okay. If they haven't, that's not the end of the world. What I would do at that point is I would read the remaining short questions and I would complete the total of 4 at this point, 4 from the 6, that's your requirement. And what I would do is I would leave for now the 2 that you felt least confident about. And I expect there'll be a couple of tough ones in there. So you might be able to find those ones easy enough, the ones that you don't like. At this stage now, after doing 4 short questions, I would look through the long questions carefully. And this is the key thing I'm going to say. Spend time looking at the long questions. Not at the start of the exam when you're trying to take everything in, but now at this stage when you're picking the 2. Find the 2 you're the most confident with and complete the 2 questions at this point. Maybe do 1 first and then have another look and find the next one you're happy with. But do them out and finish them. If something goes wrong and you realize like, oh God, I actually can't do a part 2 here, and that leads on to a part 3 and I'm stuck, of course, abandon it and move on. You can do it another one. That's no problem. But generally speaking, if you spent the time picking 2 long questions, do them, finish them. And at that stage, you've actually finished everything that you need to do, but I imagine you have plenty of time left. It depends on the student, depends on the exam, but I imagine everyone's going to have time remaining at that point. Strong recommendation, do not leave the exam early and ignore the students who do leave. I also teach economics. Economics used to be on at the same time as agricultural economics. It was often the last exam students did. The agricultural economics exam used to take 2 hours because it was a project. The economics exam used to be 2.5. Oftentimes you'd have students leaving the ag exam after an hour and a half, an hour and 40, an hour and 50 after 2 hours. And sometimes, well, in the very first time I was teaching economics, what did I see? Only a couple of my own students coming out after an hour and 50 or 2 hours. Every year after that, I warned my students, I said, I'm going to be standing outside that exam hall and I'm not going to be happy if I see you coming out before the 2.5 hours. Now, I can't stand outside all your exam halls, but I would. And if I saw you coming out at the maths exam early, I wouldn't be happy. One thing I will say is some students will leave the exam very early. Somewhere in the country this year, someone will leave the exam very early because they'll look at it and they'll realize it's not suiting them. And they'll realize their accredited grade is going to be better than what they're likely to get on this paper because it's just one has come up in a way that doesn't suit them. That's not the end of the world for that student. But for you, don't let it affect you. Just ignore those and drive on. You focus on what's in front of you. Now back to your exam. Unless you feel one of the long questions has gone worse than what you originally expected, I actually would not advise you to do another long question. They're 50 marks. We would say, that's roughly 25 minutes of work. And what I'd say is, like, you've got 25 minutes of work, right? If you spend that doing another long question, when you're maybe getting a bit tired at this stage, are you likely to do better than the first 2 long questions you've done? I'm not so sure that you are. My general advice would be to go back and consider doing 1 extra short question if you have plenty of time. If you feel you may score better in this than some of the other short questions. At that time, you've now done an extra short question, so 5 short questions and the 2 long questions. That would be my advice of what to do in general. My advice then would be spend the extra time at this stage going back through the questions you completed, particularly the long questions. You might say, well, hold on, why didn't I spend the time doing the long questions before I did the 5th short question? And you can do that, of course. But sometimes it's good to have a little bit of a break from the questions and then go back and look at them again. You might even want to do them out again on a blank, on a sheet, an extra sheet, where you're not looking at the work you originally did. And you do that if you felt you had made an error and you couldn't spot it. So what you do is this: you got to make sure, check that you have answered the question that was asked and have given the correct unit. I'm actually going to highlight this here. I'm going to highlight this. Look, I've seen it happen where students lose out on a grade because they didn't put in centimeters squared, because they didn't round it to 3 decimal places as they were asked. Make sure that you answer the question that was asked. That's where I'd be spending my extra time. If you have the questions, if you have in the questions you have done, try not to leave anything blank. If you're looking at a question and if you don't know what to do, do what you know. It might be an awkward chain rule in differentiation. You might be looking at saying, how do I do this again? You might be sure what to do, but if it's differentiation and say it's ln, you know from the table book that ln differentiates to be 1 over whatever is inside the bracket in the ln, and okay, then there's going to be a chain rule part. But even by doing that first part, you're going to likely get low partial credit. That might be 40% in your worst question. And if you're getting 40% in your worst question, well, look, it's not too bad. If you don't have a clue, just try something. Just try writing something down. You can't get anything for a blank page. Remember this in general, you don't have to get everything right. What's important is you get it started. In math, sometimes, of course, remember back to primary school and you wanted to be able to, get all the arithmetic right. 12 times 15 or whatever it be. You want to get the right answer because it's either right or wrong, but it's not like that in Leaving Cert Maths. There's low partial credit, mid partial credit, high partial credit. What's important is you get it started and you keep ticking on the partial credits. You're going to be getting some parts right. And overall, I suppose I'll just say one thing. I'll say 2 things actually based on but they've just came to my mind. My own maths teacher, a man named Joe Kingston, he corrected Leaving Cert Maths for 50 years in a row. 50 years, and never once in the scripts that he corrected did he ever correct 100% paper. So you correct around 300 a year. He did it for 50 years. He can do the maths. Never once did he correct 100% paper. And the other thing he said to us as students was a tough paper is not always the worst thing, because a tough paper has to be marked somewhat generously so that they end up with the results similar to previous years. So if the exam is hard, try not to panic. Just try to keep working away. Sometimes it happens you do a few poor questions at the start, and you know what, maybe your last question you ace it. Sometimes that's just the way it goes. So on that, I'm going to wish you the very best of luck in your exams, especially, of course, your 2 maths exams. And I hope that when you open that first paper, some of the advice that I've given you comes to your mind and some of those predictions come up. Okay, good luck to everybody.